Hey, what's up, everybody? How's it going? So, welcome to week 2 of Teaching Tuesdays, or if you're on YouTube, welcome to lesson number 2. And so, last week we talked about introductory stuff to the piano, starting with Bartók's Musical Cosmos, kind of learning how to read the staff, learning where the notes are, learning flats and sharps, and kind of all that introductory stuff. So, today we're going to be doing introductory stuff, but in terms of theory and technique. So, today I think the best place to start is with scales. And so scales, if you don't know, is a series of notes played one after another, and they kind of make up a whole, kind of give us like the notes in order to play a piece. So each piece is kind of based off different notes. So for example, Amazing Grace is based off like the G scale, right? Or we played Clarity earlier on stream, and Clarity is based off like the A flat major scale. And yeah, so first let's figure out how we construct these scales. So the main scales that we're going to be talking about today is major and minor scales. So for our major scale, there is a formula in order to create each of these scales, any major scale that you want, right? And so this formula comes down to whole steps and half steps. So let's talk about that first. So a half step is when you go to the next key up or down to the key that you're starting on. So for example, if we're starting on C, we want to go a half step above C. We're going to the note immediately right next to it, whether it's a black or white key. So above C, we have this C sharp, because that's the next note right next to it. So that's a half step up. And a note below C, the immediate note is B. So B is a half step below C, right? And so for example, if you go to A, you go a half step above A, you get the next note right above it, which is A sharp or B flat. Same thing if you want to go a half step lower, you go down to A flat or G sharp. And for a whole step, you're just going to go 2 half steps. So above C, you go 1 half step, another half step, you get to D. So it's basically like one note up next, right? So the next one, if you go from D, you go a half step up, D sharp, next half step up is to E. So a whole step from D is E, a whole step going down from D is letter C, right? So that's our whole steps and half steps. And to make any major scale, we call it, the formula here, let's pull this. Okay, so we have whole, half, whole, half. So let's look at it on the keyboard first, and then we'll kind of talk about it, how it looks on the page, because I think it's important to learn both. Great. So what these means is this is the orders of whole steps and half steps. And so for example, if we start with our C major scale, we start with C, and we go a whole step above C, which we figure out is D. That's our first whole step. Then we go to the next whole step above D, which is E. Okay, that's over here. Now we go a half step above E, so the note immediately above E, which is F. That's our half step. We go up to G for a whole step, A, whole step, B, whole step, and a half step above B brings us back to C. Right, and so later in the technique lesson, we'll talk about how to properly play these scales and the proper fingerings for all that. But this is the construction of any major scale, right? So that's C. So we have C to whole, half, whole, half step. Okay, so if we go to, for example, let's do one with maybe sharps. So let's go to G scale. So the G scale has the same formula, where we go G major scale. So if we go from G, we're going to go up to A, whole, half step to C, whole step to D, whole step to E, whole step to F sharp, right? Because the whole step above E is half step makes it the whole step, which is F sharp, and then we get to G, which is the half step. So we have, and that gives us our G major scale. Okay, let's do one more with more sharps. So if we go to, let's start on the E scale, or E major. So if we go from E, we're going to go up a whole step, which is half step. Okay, this is E to F sharp. A whole step above F sharp is to the next black key, right? Because half step. So you go E, F sharp, G sharp. Then next is the half step over here, where we go G sharp over to A. And then we have whole step, whole step, So if you remember this whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half, you can basically create any scale, any major scale, without even knowing the key signatures, right? If you just follow these orders of steps, right? So the other one that we're going to talk about briefly is the minor scale. And today we're mainly talking about major scales just to keep it simple, and minors can go, because there's like 3 different types of minor scales and kind of gets complicated. But just to briefly go over it, the minor scale, we're going to talk about the natural minor scale, where we have a different combination where we have whole, half, whole, whole, half, whole, whole. Okay, so for the minor scale, let's start in the A minor scale, because that one has all white keys. So if we go a whole step above the A, we get to B, we get the half step to C, then we have whole to D, whole to E, half step to F, whole step to G, and whole step to A. Right, so the minor scale sounds very sad, it sounds a little bit incomplete, right? There's it kind of just sounds dead, to me at least. Of course there are some pretty minor scales and many pieces are written in the minor key, but for when we're talking about this natural minor scale, it sounds pretty incomplete to me, right? So that's what we have: major scales and minor scales. And related to this, what follows is we're going to learn about key signatures, and you'll see this all throughout the pieces. Oh, sorry, let's go back really quickly. Let's just write out some scales just so we see it. Right, so if we have a C, right, we're just going up in steps all the way through. So if you haven't seen scales yet and you're just starting piano, this is kind of what they look like, right? They just go up all in steps, going from notes on a line like C, going up to D, which is on a space, up to E, up to F, up to G, etc. And we'll take a look a little bit more about these when we actually play them, because I think it helps to see it. All right, so let's go to key signatures. And so just like in scales, keys in music gives us a certain feeling, right? So if I open this, give me 1 second. Great. So if I open this, this is what we call the circle of fifths, and this kind of explains to us all the different keys and key signatures and what has what sharps and which key has what flats and all that stuff. It looks really confusing, but we're going to break it down to make it super easy for you, right? So the point of a key is to give a piece of music a certain color, right? If we play a piece in C major, right, so C major chord has a very different feel and I guess color than D major, right? Some people say D major is really happy. Maybe if we go to G minor, it sounds very sad and very dark. If we go to, let's say, E major, it's also very bright, or B major. And all of these have a different sound because of the sharps and flats that are involved. So let's go over this, and this will help us figure out our key signatures whenever we read any of our pieces. So starting at the very top of this circle of fifths, we call this, is our C. So C is at the top because it is our first major scale, and it has 0 sharps and 0 flats. Right, so just like we did earlier, if we follow our whole, half, whole, half, so C, half step, whole, half, we don't run into any flats or any sharps. Going to the right of this, we start to add 1 sharp. Right, so if we go over to here and we played our G scale, and we follow our major scale pattern. So G starting whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step. We realized that we ran into 1 sharp, which is F sharp. Right, and then if we go to the next one, if G has 1 sharp, this next one, key of D, is going to have 2 sharps. And so if we try the same step and we start on D, we go do our major scale to whole step, we have the F sharp, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, we get another sharp, which is C sharp, with the half step leading us to D. So in D, we have 2 sharps, which is F sharp and C sharp. Now we can keep going around the circle. So A has 3 sharps, E will have 4 sharps, B will have 5 sharps, and then here at the bottom it switches either to sharps or flats depending on how you want to look at it. And so this is one way that we can memorize it, right? We can just memorize which scale has which sharps, but there's also another way that we can memorize it where we have the acronym BEAD, let me draw this. G, sorry, it's hard to draw with a cursor. Maybe I should get like a tablet here. B, G, C, F, right? And so this is what we call the order of flats and sharps. So if you go this way, this is our flats. Sorry, this is our flats, the order of flats. So the first flat that comes is B flat, and then goes E flat, A flat, D flat, G flat, C flat, and F flat. But if you go the other way, that's our order of sharps. So as you see here, sorry about that. So as you see here, right? So F is the first sharp that you got, just like we had in the G scale. Then the next one is C, so then you have both F sharp and C sharp. Then as you keep adding them in like letter A, which it will have 3 sharps, then we'll have F sharp, C sharp, and G sharp, and this is kind of the order of sharps and flats. So one thing to memorize is this B, G, C, F, so that you know each direction and which sharps and which flats to start off with, right? So if we follow this B, to G, C, F, we'll know that the first flat comes with B, so this is going to have B flat. We know that the B flat scale has, of course, it's going to have B flat because it's in the name. And then since it has 2 flats, the next flat in the order is E. So now we know that this has B flat and E flat. After this, we have E flat. Of course, we know that E flat has to be in it because of the name of the scale. And then we have hello, thank you for the follow, I appreciate it. So we have E flat, and then let's follow our order of scale. So we have B flat, E flat, and A flat because we know it has 3 flats in it. Right, so this is how we use it, and I guess I should explain this in the beginning. Why we call this the circle of fifths is that we start with C, and then we go 5 notes above C, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is G, and that leads us to our next step in the scale. 5 notes above G, G is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, gets us to D, and that's how we find the next one, right? So it all is based off this C as the very start of this circle of fifths, and then we kind of keep going around the circle towards the G, D, A, E, and we start adding it on. All right, so this is one way you can kind of just internalize them and memorize them, or memorize this order of how to create a major scale to remember which notes have sharps and which notes have flats, or which scales have sharps and which scales have flats. But this is not always the most practical, and we kind of need to learn how to identify them as well on the staff. Okay, so let's switch over here. We're going to go back to our staff, and we're going to pretend that we have some music here. Okay, I'm going to leave the circle of fifths image on the side so that you guys can follow along. And key signatures are really important because you're going to see them all throughout your music. It's going to help you to be able to identify the key, which will help you figure out which chords and which notes that your pieces are going to rely on. Okay, so if we go, oh, sorry, it's not showing. Here we go. Okay, so if we show this, and let's start with our first, so if we go back to our circle down there, let's start with the first scale where we have G. So our G scale, we're going to start on G, and then we're going to go up to A, to B, to C, to D, to E, to F, and then back up to G. Okay, and so our key signature, as we figured out earlier, our G scale has 1 sharp, which is F sharp. So over here in the beginning of all your pieces, if your piece will have a key signature, it's going to have a little sharp in the beginning of the key, in the beginning of the staff, that lets you know which note is going to be sharped or flat throughout the whole piece. So in this scale, we have F sharp being the one that's sharp. So instead of writing it in front of every single note, they're just going to put it in the key signature over here at the left. Right? And so we obviously know that this, by having an F sharp here, is a G, indicates the key of G major because we have the scale written out. But if we didn't have the scale written out and we just had this F sharp here, how would we know that it's in the key of G? Well, other than memorizing the circle of fifths and adding 1 sharp as you go around the circle, we can also take a look at this note, or the sharp over here, and we see that it's on the F sharp line. And if you go a half step above the F sharp, you'll know that it's going to be G. So that gives you the G major scale. If we go over to here again, and we give us a key with different sharps, so let's and don't forget we always have to follow the order of sharps. So B, E, this is the order of flats. If we go backwards, it's the order of sharps. Okay, so F sharp is the first sharp, so that means we always have to draw F sharp first. Then if we let's do the key with 3 sharps. So we're gonna go following the order: F sharp, C sharp, and then G sharp. Okay, G sharp's gonna float over here. How do we know what key this is? Well, you can memorize that the scale of A has C sharp, F sharp, G sharp, and A, and so that's how you can figure out that this is A. But if you forget, you can look at the very last sharp, which is G sharp, and go a half step above it, which gives you the letter A, and that's how you know we're gonna be in A major, and the pieces, this piece is gonna use notes around the A major scale, right? So for sharps, you're gonna go to the last sharp, and you're just gonna go a half step above that sharp. Okay, so that's that one. And for flats, this one's a little bit easier. So the one that you're gonna have to memorize is the first one, right? So if you follow the circle of fifths right below me, you know that the first key with a flat is the key of F. So F major has 1 flat, which is B flat. Okay, and then if we keep going, we see that we have a key of 2 flats. In order to figure out which key this is, or which scale that we're going to be used for this one, is we're going to go to the second flat, so or the second to last flat. So this is the last flat over here. If we go to the second to last flat on B flat, that's how you know which key and which scale we're going to be using, which is B flat major. If we go over here, let's do one more. Oh, you can't see this anymore. So let's erase this. Let's do a different one. So let's do a harder one. So we're going to have 4 flats in this key. So if we follow the order of flats, which is B, E, A, D, okay, we're going to have 4 flats. So we have B, E, A, D flat. How do we know which key this is? Well, we're going to go to the second to last flat. So this is D flat. If we go to the second last flat, which is on this A flat space, then we know that this piece is in the key of A flat major. Cool. So that's kind of our key signatures, right? So if we look at any piece of music that you're trying to look at and study, you'll instantly be able to know which key it is in using these kind of tricks, using finding the sharps. So remember with the sharps, look at the last sharp, you go a half step above. So if we have F sharp over here, we know our scale is going to be on G. If we're looking at flats, you're going to look at the second to last flat, like over here where we have A flat, and so we're going to be using the A flat scale, just like we learned how to figure out our scales earlier. Okay, good. And so the next thing I wanted to cover before we get into chords is we're going to go into intervals. Okay, and so let's see if I can explain intervals correctly. Intervals, for some reason, for me, has always been hard to explain. So doing this teaching is good for me because it gives me another opportunity to try and explain it clearly. Okay, so what an interval is the distance between 2 notes. Hello, thank you for the follow. And an interval is the distance between 2 notes. So let's look at the keyboard first. Okay, so if we have a C and we have a D, what is the distance between these 2 notes? And it's simple as you're counting the note, C as 1 and D is 2. And so we call this a second. Nice and easy. Call it a second. If we go from C again, and we go, let's say, all the way to A, let's count the actual notes. So we have C as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we know that C to A is a distance of a sixth, or the interval is a sixth between them. Great. And so now, there are all different types of intervals, right? So there are obviously 7 different intervals with the numbers before we have to repeat. And then you can keep going higher if you want a 9th, 10th, 11th, etc. But we also have major and minor intervals. So a major interval is where the note, the distance between them remains in the same key, right? So let's take the C major scale, for example. Okay, we have C, D, thank you for the follow, E, F, G, A, B, C. This is our C major scale. Okay, and so let's take, for example, C to A, just like we did. Okay, so we counted the notes again. So this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we know that C to A is an interval of a sixth. And so now after this, you have to decide whether it's a major sixth or a minor sixth. And how you determine that is if you look at the scale and this note is within the scale, which it clearly is right here, this A, we know that it's going to be a major sixth because it's in the major scale. Right, so C to A, both within the C scale, so that means it's going to be a major sixth. And if you want it to be a minor sixth, you're just going to lower the sixth to the lowest half step right below it. So C to A is a major sixth. If we want to lower it to a minor sixth, you're going to go a half step below the sixth note, which gets us to the A flat. And you hear that we have quite of a different sound, right? Major sixth to minor sixth. Okay, if we do the same thing with a third, so let's find a third. So what's a third above C? We count the distance between the notes. We have C, D, E. So E, C to E is our third. Okay, and if we want to figure out what kind of third it is, we look in the C scale and we see that E is right there within the C scale. So we know that it is a major third. Just like with the A example, if we wanted to make it a minor third, we would lower the third a half step to E flat. Right, so we go from major third, C to E, to a half step, C to E flat. And so why are these intervals important? So a lot of people ask about learning how to play by ear, right? And so if you listen to melodies, melodies are all about intervals, right? So if you sing, let's say, Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, right? Right, so if you're trying to learn Twinkle Twinkle Little Star by ear, all you're doing is using intervals and hearing the distance between the notes. Right, so if you can start to recognize that, okay, so the first note is C in Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. The second note that changes is on G. If you can hear that it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 notes apart, you're gonna know which key to go to. Okay, and I hear the second note going up to the third note. It almost sounds like a second. So I know that I go to A, and then you go down to G, and you just hear it going down by steps. Right, so these intervals are important because they kind of help you use your ear in order to figure out which notes you're playing if you're trying to play by ear. But if you're not trying to play by ear, it is also important because when you read sheet music, it's a lot easier sometimes to read the intervals rather than reading the individual notes. Just kind of like we read over here, right? If we see C to E over here, after you're reading these a bunch of times, you can memorize that this is C, and you can memorize that this is E, or you can also memorize that this is a third apart, right? You can kind of memorize the distance on the paper, and you'll know that you're just gonna have to go a skip up. Right, so learning intervals also helps with the ear training, and it helps with visually and learning how to sight read, and also how to play faster. Lastly, these also kind of help us with making these chords. So let's go into chords. Before we go into chords, let's do a quick test. Okay, so if we go, let's use our D scale. Okay, so if you guys are following along with me either at home or on the video on YouTube, on Twitch, feel free to join me. Okay, so we're going to use the D scale. Okay, so that's our key signature. And how do we figure that out? How do we know that this is a D scale? We look to the last sharp, and we have a C sharp as the last sharp, so we know that we're in the key of D. Okay, so let's draw our D scale. D, E, F, G, A, B, C, and D. So if we number all these, this is 1, this is 2, this is 3, this is 4, this is 5, this is 6, this is 7, this is 8. Let's test our intervals. So if we go from D, okay, so our starting note is going to be D, and I want us to go to C sharp next. What interval number is that? So if you use the scale above here to help you, we know that it is a seventh apart. And we know that it is a major seventh, we call it, because the C sharp is within the scale of D. It is worth noting that we have major and minor intervals, or major, minor, seconds, thirds, sixths, sevenths, whatever. But the two interesting ones that we do it is for fourths and fifths, we call these perfect. So to be honest, I'm not exactly sure what the reason, or I forgot why we call this a perfect fourth and perfect fifth, but for fourths and fifths, we call them perfect, right? So if we go from D and we go 4 notes up, E, F sharp, G, we have a fourth above D. We call this a perfect fourth, or if you have a fifth, we call it a perfect fifth. So that's a little crash course on intervals there. So we have major and minor intervals, and we also have the 2 perfect intervals, which is fourths and fifths. Cool. I should have called your 7 months of major. All right. Thank you everybody in Twitch chat for tuning in. All right, guys. So we covered scales, right? How to create scales using whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step. We covered key signatures and how to figure out key signatures using the circle of fifths, right? Following along the circle of fifths, knowing which keys have sharps, right? If we follow along from C, no sharps, no flats. If you go following the circle of fifths to G, you start to add 1 sharp, then 2 sharps, then 3 sharps, then 4 sharps, etc. And how we figure out which sharps we add is using the bead GCF, right? Bead GCF is the order of flats. If you go backwards, that's how you get the order of sharps. And now we just learned how to create intervals. The last thing that I want to talk to you guys about today is going into chords, a little bit about chords. We can talk about chords all day. There's a million types of chords. But I want to at least get out the basics of the major chords and some of their intervals and changes of them. Inversions is what you call it. And then we'll get into some technique practice. Okay, so if we go back to C major, we talk about the C major chord you might have heard. And chords are really important because they're kind of the backbone of all pieces, right? So any pop song that you listen to uses chord progressions. You guys probably heard of those, maybe 1, 4, 5. If you guys don't know what those are, we'll talk about that a little bit now. So let's draw our C, right? And so the C, or a major chord, if you think about the scale, right? So this is why we learn the scales first, because it's all based on the scales. If we start on C and we want to figure out our C major chord, we think about the C scale, and then we go to the first, the third, and the fifth note. So the first note in the C scale is C, the third note in the C scale is E, and the fifth note is G. And this creates our C major scale, or C major chord, I'm sorry. C major triad, right? It's called a triad because it's all 3 notes. And that's literally all how you create major triads, right? If we want to say an F chord, okay? You think about the F scale, which is F, I won't write it, but F, G, A, B flat, C, D, E, F. If we think about the first note in the F scale, which is F, you think about the third note in the F scale, which is A. You think about the fifth note in the F scale, which is C. This gives us our major chord. Right, so F major chord. If you want to go G, G is the first note in the G scale. The third note, if you know what your scale is B. The fifth note is D. This gives us our G major chord. If we want to create minor chords, you think about the same thing, the same exact major chord, and then you just lower the middle note, lowering, making the, so if we're speaking of the G major chord, G, B, D, we're going to lower the second note in the chord to down to a B flat, right? So if we have G, B, D as our major chord, we want to lower the third, right? The third note, we want to lower it so that it becomes a B flat, and that changes it to our minor chord. Right? So if we go to C, right, we have another C chord. We have C, E, and G as our C major chord. If you want to make it a C minor chord, we lower the third note becomes E flat, so we have C, E flat, and G. Okay, and so these are kind of that's like a very brief crash course into chords, and why, like I said earlier, this is important because we have many let's see, we have many pieces that rely on these chords, right? So if we go to a quick example of the Piano Man, right, we have, let's see, what is it? Right, so we start on the C chord, we go to the G chord, then we go to the F chord, right? So if you see music that has stuff like this kind of helps you to learn, right? So if I switch this really quickly, and we go over here, and we take a look at this is what we have is the Piano Man. Okay, and now I'm looking out all the way over here. Okay, and so on the top we have a C chord, right? You'll see this on a lot of jazz music or pop music where you have kind of these chords, and this helps you to learn what to play and kind of what is the breakdown of the pieces. So over here we start the melody with the C chord, then over here we go down to a G chord, then over here the third chord we go down to F chord, back to C, then we go to F chord, back to C chord, and then here we go to our D chord. Right, so that's just a little bit of an example of why these chords are important and why they kind of help you if you're starting to learn pop music or starting to read any types of music where you'll see chords all around. Cool. So that is a quick crash course on scales, key signatures, intervals, and chords. And so now we're going to take a quick break here and we'll cut the YouTube video. And if you guys would like to check out the next one, we're going to do a brief lesson on technique of how to practice these scales that we just learned, how to go over arpeggios, which is kind of a breakdown of these chords, and also going into somewhat of a chord progression practice. So thanks so much guys for tuning in. This was basic guide to theory, and now we're going to lead into basic guide to technique right after this. So thank you and see you on the next video.